Hi there, my name is Esther and I'm going to be talking to you about how teachers can build motivation for learning in the classroom. I want to share with you how I plan to make student motivation a focus as students return to school. So it's important that I begin this presentation by crediting Peps Mccrea. I listened to an episode of Naylor's Natter and heard him talking about his new book called Motivated Teaching. I ordered the book the very next day and I'd finished the book within an hour and a half. So much of what he had written resonated with me, and this remains at the forefront of my mind as students return to school on March the 8th. The premise of the book is that motivation is a system for allocating attention. He says that attention is the gatekeeper of learning, so what we attend to is ultimately what we learn. He then describes motivation as a kind of investment engine that allocates attention based on the best available investment of value, expectancy, and cost. Basically, we are more likely to want to do something if the opportunity offers the greatest value, the highest expectancy, and the lowest cost. So how can this help us as teachers and leaders? I think what Mccrea tells us is that setting the right conditions for motivated learning is very much in our hands. We must start with the right mindset. We have to recognise that motivation isn't a fixed thing and that students can be motivated by different things at different times. So it is our job as teachers to create attractive opportunities in lessons so students feel motivated. And it's very clear that this is not about making learning fun or plying students with endless rewards. It is about taking a persistently proactive approach to building motivation in the way we plan, enact, and reflect on our lessons, and indeed the way we think about the whole process of learning. Mccrea identifies 5 core drivers of motivation as pictured in the diagram here. I'm going to take you through each driver in turn and give you an insight into how this has influenced me as a classroom practitioner and how I plan to use this for motivated teaching when students return to school for face-to-face learning. The first driver is called securing success. This is something that Rosenshine also talks about in his Principles of Instruction. Mccrea says that we should give students a high success rate to look back on. We should frame what success means and help students to attribute it accurately. That we should help students to preempt failure. In my classroom, I always aim to make students feel successful in the first 10 minutes of the lesson. Securing success early and getting students on boards helps to motivate them throughout the whole lesson. This is generally achieved through recall tasks by using low-stakes quizzing of previous content or showcasing the great work that students did last lesson. Another thing I have done throughout the period of remote teaching in lockdown is to focus on the positives and make sure that my language reflects this. So even if students have not submitted work or completed task sets, I've been mindful to focus on the work that was submitted or the ones that really hit the mark. This links to driver 2, nudging norms, which we'll look at shortly. I also tend to ask students to reflect on a series of assessments of their progress over time rather than their most recent mark. I want them to see that performance fluctuates, it's the learning that's important. I also want them to know that they can influence their progress over time rather than seeing it as something fixed or something that has been predetermined by me or the school. I also talk to them about what it feels like when we do less well than expected and when we feel disappointed. I want my students to understand that this is part of the process of learning and that we are never going to get it right every single time. Driver 2 is called running routines, and I think this really makes a difference. Mccrea tells us that there are 2 types of routine: instructional routines that make the process of learning easy but the content challenging, and behavioural routines which create space and time for learning because students are not having to think about their behaviour. As Mccrea says, this is an economic driver. It's about being slick and efficient with time. He says that by designing routine, scripting chains of instructions and using cues, we take away a lot of the noise for our students. He tells us that the hardest thing to do is to stick to the routines that we implement, but that it's worth persevering because we're likely to see the returns if we stick with it. For me, this is all about designing routines in an intentional way. So think about the aspects of your lessons that lend themselves to routines. For me, this is about how students enter the room and settle to learning. I think it's also important to name the routine so that students recognise the language and respond to your cues. You can rehearse the routines before you implement them, so students understand why they are doing it and experience what it feels like to go through the process before they do it for real. I think it's interesting to reflect on the routines we use. As an NQT, I was red hot on routines, but there have been phases of my career when I have let these slip. I think they're really important actually, particularly at the start of lessons, to ensure that the climate for learning is established in the right way at the right time. The third driver is called nudging norms, and this is the one that really sings to me. Mccrea tells us that we should elevate the visibility of desirable norms, amplify a peer approval, and focus on what you want to happen rather than what you don't. I recognise in this many of the pitfalls I have fallen foul of in the past. It's too easy to focus on students who have not handed in their homework or those who have fallen short of expectations, when in fact we should be doing the opposite. Something I've been working on over lockdown is using language to tell the story of my class. I constantly say, we do this because this is just the kind of class we are, this is how we roll, and the students have responded enormously well to this. During lockdown, there have been students who have not responded in the chat or made verbal contributions, so I can't honestly say that I have had a handle on everyone's learning. But I have made a conscious choice to highlight the students who are working well and those who have been particularly good, participating regularly. This helps to create a culture that everyone wants to be part of. So I hope that those students who have been more distant still feel like members of my class. I have asked students to nominate their peers for good work and talk about why they have been successful. And it's been lovely when some of the quieter voices of the group have been recognised by their classmates. All of this helps to create a positive and inclusive culture, and this is something I intend to harness even further when we get back to face-to-face lessons. Driver 4 is about building belonging, so another social driver. This links to nudging norms and is about being inclusive so that every single member of the group feels like they're part of something bigger than themselves. Mccrea says that we should develop a unifying purpose and a common goal. He also says that as teachers, we should earn and keep trust by having credibility, showing we care, and being consistent. For me, this is about naming and thanking those who make contributions explicitly, even over-communicating this at times. I use an inclusive language, using words like we and us rather than you and me, and talk about the common goal we share regularly. Even though I include myself in the us of our group, the class know that I am the teacher, the expert in the room. They trust me and they know that I'm there to support and enable their success. The final driver is boosting buy-in. Mccrea says this is about exposing the benefits of the choices we make for pupils by explaining the rationale and exploring the why. A really good example of this is the way we're preparing for the Year 11 assessments at the end of this crazy academic year. I will be talking to my Year 11 class about why we won't be covering Macbeth, for example, as planned, and why we will only be looking at one unseen poem. Mccrea says it's important to talk about the benefits from students' point of view rather than the teachers or the schools or the governments, because this is much harder for them to relate to. I have been using lots of micro-choice questions like, are we up for this? Are we ready to get started? Shall we move on now or should we spend a bit longer on this? I think this helps them to feel that they can influence and help steer the pace of the lesson. I think boosting buy-in is about taking hearts and minds with you, and that's about doing all the things that I've discussed today, being inclusive, being credible, and using the right language, for example. So when we get back to some level of normality with face-to-face lessons, I think we have an opportunity to reset and focus on student motivation. I will be focusing on success and asking my students to feel it deeply and mindfully, to dwell on those feelings and use them to sustain motivation when things get a bit tough. I'm going to use routines so that students can focus on learning, overlearning, relearning. I'm going to focus on all the great things that are typical of my group and celebrate them. I'm going to talk about the common ground we have and the common goal we share. I'm going to be consistent and inclusive with my language choices, and I'm going to secure hearts and minds by being credible in my expertise, caring in my manner, and consistent in my approach. I highly recommend Motivated Teaching by Peps Mccrea. It's a really accessible read, packed with loads of practical tips and advice. I'm going to have this at the forefront of my mind as I plan my lessons from now on. Teaching is about powerful knowledge, it's about expert planning, but it's also about creating the conditions for motivated learning. I really hope you've enjoyed my talk. Thank you.